The early morning sun painted golden streaks across the Grand Plaza Hotel's windows as Sarah Chen stood before the full-length mirror in her bridal suite. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the delicate lace of her wedding dress, a beautiful ivory creation that her mother had helped her choose 6 months ago. At 28, Sarah had always imagined this day, but the reality was far more overwhelming than any of her dreams. Down the hall, in a separate suite, Michael Torres adjusted his bow tie for the 10th time. His best man, James, watched with amusement as the usually composed surgical resident fussed with his appearance. The two had been friends since their first day of medical school, and James had never seen Michael so nervous or so happy. "You're going to wear out that tie before you even say, 'I do'?" James teased, walking over to help his friend. The story of Sarah and Michael's romance had become something of a legend at Metropolitan General Hospital, where they both worked as medical residents. They had met 2 years ago during a particularly challenging night shift in the emergency room. Sarah, specializing in pediatrics, had been treating a young boy with severe asthma when Michael, then a first-year surgical resident, was called in for consultation. Their professional interaction that night had turned into coffee in the hospital cafeteria, which led to proper dates, and eventually, a love story that their colleagues couldn't stop talking about. They were the perfect match, both dedicated to their patients, passionate about medicine, and completely devoted to each other. Sarah's mother, Lisa Chen, entered the bridal suite carrying a small blue box. "Something borrowed," she said softly, opening it to reveal a pair of pearl earrings that had been in their family for 3 generations. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears as her mother carefully fastened them to her ears. "Mom, please don't make me cry. The makeup artist will kill me," Sarah laughed, trying to fan her eyes dry. The bridal suite was a flurry of activity as bridesmaids in pale blue dresses helped with last-minute preparations. Sarah's younger sister, Emily, was attempting to arrange the train of the wedding dress while her best friend Rachel touched up her own makeup. The room smelled of hairspray, perfume, and the fresh roses that filled the bouquets. Meanwhile, Michael's family had gathered in his suite. His father, Robert Torres, a retired firefighter, stood proudly watching his only son prepare for the biggest day of his life. Michael's mother, Carmen, was already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and his younger sisters were taking countless photos on their phones. "My hijo," Carmen said, straightening Michael's boutonniere, "your abuela would be so proud today." She referred to Michael's grandmother, Maria, who was in hospice care and too ill to attend the wedding. The mention of his beloved grandmother brought a shadow of sadness to Michael's eyes, but he quickly brightened. "We'll visit her right after the ceremony," he promised. "I want her to see Sarah in her wedding dress." The morning seemed to fly by in a blur of photographs, last-minute adjustments, and nervous excitement. The hotel staff bustled about, making final preparations in the grand ballroom where the reception would be held. 200 guests were expected, family, friends, colleagues from the hospital, and even some of their favorite long-term patients who had become like family. As the clock ticked closer to the 11 a.m. ceremony, Sarah took one final look in the mirror. Her dark hair was elegantly styled with tiny white flowers woven throughout, and her makeup was flawless. The dress fit perfectly, highlighting her slender frame while the lace details added a touch of timeless elegance. In his suite, Michael took a deep breath and checked his watch. In less than an hour, he would be standing at the altar, waiting for the woman who had changed his life. He thought about the personal vows he had written, safely tucked into his jacket pocket, and smiled, knowing that every word came straight from his heart. Neither Sarah nor Michael could have known that this perfect morning was the beginning of not just their wedding day, but also their last day on Earth. As guests began to arrive and the wedding coordinator made her final rounds, fate was already setting in motion a chain of events that would turn this celebration of love into a story that would touch hearts and shock communities across the nation. The clock struck 10:30 a.m., and the wedding coordinator knocked on Sarah's door. "It's time," she announced cheerfully. In just 30 minutes, the ceremony would begin, and shortly after that, Sarah Chen and Michael Torres would make a decision that would seal their place in history, not as the successful doctors they were destined to become, but as heroes who would sacrifice everything for strangers in need. The grand cathedral fell silent as the first notes of cannon in D filled the air. 200 guests stood, turning toward the massive wooden doors at the entrance. Michael Torres stood at the altar, his heart pounding beneath his tuxedo as he waited for his first glimpse of Sarah. The bridesmaids began their procession, their pale blue dresses catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Rachel, as maid of honor, gave Michael a warm smile as she took her place opposite James. Emily, Sarah's sister, dabbed at her eyes before she even reached the altar, already overcome with emotion. Then the music changed, and everyone held their breath. Sarah appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, and audible gasps echoed through the cathedral. David Chen, typically stoic and reserved, was visibly fighting back tears as he prepared to walk his eldest daughter down the aisle. Sarah's hand trembled on his arm, but her smile was radiant. Michael felt his own eyes grow wet as he watched Sarah approach. She moved with grace, her dress flowing behind her like a stream of moonlight. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The guests, the music, the nervous excitement. There was only Sarah. "She's beautiful," Carmen Torres whispered to her husband, gripping his hand tightly. Robert nodded, unable to speak as he watched his son's face light up with pure joy. The walk down the aisle seemed both eternal and far too short. When they reached the altar, David Chen kissed his daughter's cheek through her veil, then placed her hand in Michael's. "Take care of each other," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The ceremony began traditionally, with the priest welcoming everyone and speaking about the sanctity of marriage. But the most touching moment came when it was time for Michael and Sarah to exchange their personal vows. Michael went first, pulling the carefully folded paper from his pocket with slightly shaking hands. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We met in the chaos of the ER, surrounded by beeping monitors and rushing nurses. But in that chaos, I found my calm. You were treating a young boy with asthma, and I watched you comfort both him and his terrified mother. In that moment, I knew you were special." Sarah's eyes welled with tears as Michael continued. "I promise to be your partner in all things. In the hospital corridors where we first fell in love, in the quiet moments at home, and in whatever challenges life brings our way. I promise to make you laugh when you're stressed, to hold you when you're tired, and to love you more each day than I did the day before." Then it was Sarah's turn. She took a deep breath, looking directly into Michael's eyes. "Michael, you came into my life like an unexpected gift. We speak the same language of healing and hope, of long nights and early mornings, of the joy of saving lives and the weight of losing them. You understand me in a way no one else ever has." She paused, steadying her voice before continuing. "I promise to be your best friend and your biggest supporter. I promise to remind you to eat during your long surgeries, to laugh at your terrible medical puns, and to face whatever life throws at us together. You make me a better doctor and a better person. I love you with all my heart." There wasn't a dry eye in the cathedral as they exchanged rings. The gold bands glinted in the sunlight streaming through the windows, symbols of promises made and a future dreamed of together. "By the power vested in me," the priest announced with a warm smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Michael lifted Sarah's veil with gentle hands, revealing her beautiful face. Their kiss was sweet and tender, a perfect moment frozen in time as their guests erupted in applause and cheers. "I present to you Dr. and Dr. Torres," the priest announced, and the newlyweds turned to face their guests, beaming with happiness. As they walked back down the aisle together, rice and rose petals showering down upon them, neither Sarah nor Michael could imagine that their time together would be measured in minutes rather than years. They were young, in love, and had their whole lives ahead of them, or so they thought. The cathedral bells rang out joyously as they stepped into the bright sunlight outside. It was 11:45 a.m. In exactly 30 minutes, their lives would change forever, and their love story would become a legend, but not for the reasons anyone could have predicted. The newlyweds stood on the cathedral steps, surrounded by their loved ones as the photographer captured the moment. The spring breeze gently rustled Sarah's veil as Michael held her close, both of them glowing with happiness. Their wedding party gathered around them, creating the perfect picture of joy and celebration. "We have about an hour before the reception starts," Michael whispered to Sarah as they posed for another photo. His thoughts drifted to his grandmother Maria, lying in her hospice bed just 15 minutes away. The woman who had raised him after his parents worked long shifts, who had taught him to speak Spanish, and who had cried tears of joy when he got into medical school. Sarah squeezed his hand, reading his mind as she often did. "We should go see her," she said softly, She should be part of this day. Michael looked at his new wife with grateful eyes. This was one of the countless reasons he loved her, her ability to understand what mattered most to him without words. Are you sure? In your wedding dress? That's exactly why we should go, Sarah smiled. Abuela Maria should see her grandson's wedding day properly. We have time before the reception. They quickly found James, the best man, and Rachel, the maid of honor, to explain their plan. We'll be quick, Michael promised. Just a 15-minute drive to Pine Valley Hospice and back. We'll make it to the reception with plenty of time. I'll tell the coordinator, Rachel offered, understanding the importance of this detour. Just be careful not to get anything on the dress, Sarah. You know how your mom will react. The wedding party started heading toward their cars, ready to drive to the Grand Plaza Hotel for the reception. Meanwhile, Michael helped Sarah into his black BMW, carefully arranging her dress so it wouldn't wrinkle. The just married sign and tin cans that James had attached to the back of the car jingled as they pulled away from the curb. As they drove, Sarah reached over and took Michael's hand. Tell me about her again, she said, knowing how much he loved sharing stories about his grandmother. Michael smiled, navigating through the quiet Sunday streets. She used to make the best churros every Sunday after church. The whole neighborhood would come by just to taste them. When I was studying for my medical board exams, she would stay up all night with me, making sure I ate and didn't fall asleep in my books. She's going to be so happy to see you, Sarah said, watching the love of her life talk about the woman who helped shape him into the man he became. The drive was peaceful, with streets relatively empty on this Sunday afternoon. They passed familiar landmarks, the park where they had their first real date, the coffee shop where Michael had proposed 6 months ago, the hospital where they both worked and first met. We should call ahead, Sarah suggested, reaching for her phone. Let them know we're coming so they can make sure she's awake. As Michael turned onto Maple Street, just 5 blocks from the hospice facility, Sarah was just hanging up the phone. They say she's having a good day, she reported happily. The nurse said she's been talking about the wedding all morning. That's when they saw it, the smoke. At first, it was just a thin gray line rising into the blue spring sky. But as they got closer, they could see it was coming from a small apartment building, one of those older 3-story structures that housed mostly elderly residents. Michael slowed the car, both of them instinctively assessing the situation as doctors. There were people on the street, pointing up at the building. An elderly woman was crying on the sidewalk, speaking rapidly in what sounded like Russian. Michael, Sarah started, her grip tightening on his hand. I know, he replied, already pulling the car over to the curb. They could hear sirens in the distance, but they weren't close enough. And there were people gathering outside the building, pointing to the upper windows where shapes could be seen moving behind the smoke. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were doctors. They had sworn an oath to help people in need. It didn't matter that it was their wedding day, that Sarah was in her beautiful white dress, that they were expected at their reception. Neither of them could have known that this decision, this instinctive choice to help, would be their last. As they stepped out of the car, Sarah's white dress gleaming in the sunlight, they were about to become part of a story that would be told for years to come. The time was 12:10 p.m. Sarah quickly kicked off her white heels as Michael threw his tuxedo jacket onto the car seat. The smoke was getting thicker, and panicked voices filled the air around them. An elderly man rushed toward them, his face streaked with soot. Please, my wife, she's still inside, 3rd floor. He coughed out, pointing at the building. She can't walk well. The elevator isn't working. Michael grabbed Sarah's hand. We should check if anyone needs medical help until the fire department arrives. The sirens still sounded distant, maybe 5 minutes away. In emergencies, they both knew 5 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah nodded, her medical training kicking in. She pulled her hair back quickly, securing it with the decorative clip that had held her veil. Her wedding dress rustled as she moved toward a group of coughing residents who had managed to escape. The scene was chaos. Some residents were still emerging from the building's main entrance, while others were calling up to family members trapped on the upper floors. The smoke was pouring out of several 3rd-floor windows now, and flames were becoming visible. Is anyone here a medical professional? Sarah called out, her voice clear and authoritative despite the chaos. Several people turned to her, surprised to see a woman in a wedding dress taking charge. I'm Dr. Chen, and this is Dr. Torres. We need to know who's still inside. An older woman stepped forward, her hands shaking. Mrs. Petrov is still up there, third floor, apartment 3C. She's on oxygen. And the Wongs in 3A, they're both in their 80s. Michael was already assessing the building's structure. The smoke wasn't too thick on the lower floors yet, and he could see a clear path to the stairwell. His father's voice echoed in his head. Robert Torres had taught his son basic fire safety from his years as a firefighter. Stay low, move fast, and check doors for heat before opening them, Michael muttered. Remembering his father's lessons, he turned to Sarah. We should split up. You check on the people out here. Set up a triage area. I'll... No. Sarah cut him off, her eyes fierce. We go together. We'll be faster working as a team, and it's safer. She had already pulled up her dress, tying it in a knot above her knees to allow better movement. A young man who had escaped from the second floor handed them 2 wet towels. The super keeps these in the lobby for the gym, he explained quickly. They're all we have. Michael and Sarah pressed the wet towels to their faces and entered the building. The lobby was hazy with smoke, but still visible. They could hear shouts and crying from above. The stairwell door was propped open, and they could see about 10 feet up before the smoke began to thicken. Third floor, Michael said through his towel. We check 3A and 3C first. Stay close to me. They moved quickly up the stairs, keeping low where the air was clearer. Sarah's once pristine dress was already gathering soot, the ivory lace turning gray. The temperature rose noticeably as they climbed, and the smoke grew thicker. On the second floor landing, they found a teenage boy helping his grandfather down the stairs. Is anyone else up there? Michael asked, helping to support the elderly man. 3B is empty. They're on vacation, the boy coughed. But I heard Mrs. Petrov calling for help. Sarah and Michael exchanged looks. The smoke was much thicker above them now, and they could hear the crackle of flames. The sirens were closer, but not close enough. We have maybe 3 minutes before this gets too dangerous, Michael said, his medical training warring with his instinct to help. Sarah gripped his hand. Then we better move fast. Her voice was steady, determined. It was the same voice she used in the ER when facing impossible odds. They started up the final flight of stairs, their wet towels pressed firmly against their faces. The heat was intense now, and the smoke made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah's dress brushed against the sooty walls as they climbed, leaving gray streaks on the once perfect white fabric. Neither of them hesitated. They were doctors. They had sworn to help people in need. As they reached the third-floor landing, they could hear someone calling weakly for help. The clock on the wall, barely visible through the smoke, showed 12:15 p.m. They had no way of knowing they had just crossed a point of no return. The third floor was an inferno. Smoke rolled across the ceiling in thick waves, and the heat pressed against them like a physical force. Sarah and Michael crouched low, moving along the hallway by touching the wall. Their wet towels offered little protection now, and both were fighting the urge to cough. 3 at first, Michael shouted over the roar of the fire, "It's closer." They found the Wong's apartment door, and Michael pressed his hand against it, checking for heat as his father had taught him. It was warm but not hot. He tried the handle locked. "Mr. Wong, Mrs. Wong," Sarah called out, pounding on the door. A faint cry answered them. Michael backed up and kicked the door near the lock, channeling the strength from his medical school soccer days. The door splintered open on the second try. Inside, they found the elderly couple huddled near their bedroom window, trying to breathe the clearer air. "We're doctors," Sarah explained quickly, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "We're here to help." She grabbed Mrs. Wong's arm while Michael supported Mr. Wong. The couple was surprisingly light, weakened by fear and smoke. Getting them down the stairs was a slow, terrifying process. The smoke had thickened even more, and flames were now visible along one wall of the hallway. When they finally reached the ground floor, 2 maintenance workers rushed forward to help the Wongs outside. Sarah turned back toward the stairs, but Michael grabbed her arm. "The fire department must be close now. We should wait." A scream cut through the roar of the flames. Mrs. Petrov, the woman on oxygen. They looked at each other, knowing what that sound meant. Someone in desperate need of help. "We can't wait," Sarah said, already heading back up. Her once beautiful dress was now gray with soot, torn at the hem where she'd stepped on it. But her eyes held the same determination they showed during difficult surgeries. They climbed the stairs again, faster this time, knowing the building wouldn't hold much longer. The heat was worse, and parts of the ceiling were starting to crack. They could hear sirens now, very close, but not close enough. When they reached 3C, they found the door already open. Mrs. Petrov was on the floor near her oxygen tank, struggling to breathe. The tank was making a hissing sound that made Michael's blood run cold. "We need to move now," he shouted, recognizing the danger. The oxygen tank could explode. Sarah was already kneeling beside Mrs. Petrov, checking her pulse. "She's weak but stable. Help me lift her." They managed to get Mrs. Petrov to her feet between them, but she was barely conscious. Progress was agonizingly slow. The smoke was so thick now that they could hardly see the stairs. Below, they could hear firefighters entering the building, shouting instructions. Just as they reached the second-floor landing, there was a tremendous crash from above. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, blocking the stairs behind them. The oxygen tank they'd left behind exploded with a deafening boom, shaking the entire building. "Down here," Michael shouted toward the firefighters' voices. "We need help." But the explosion had destabilized the structure. They could hear more creaking and crashing above them. Sarah looked at Michael, and in that moment, they both knew. They were doctors. They had sworn to protect life until their last breath. Together, they shielded Mrs. Petrov with their bodies as another section of the ceiling came down. Sarah's white dress, now almost black with soot, spread around them like wings. Michael held both women close, trying to protect them from the falling debris. The last thing anyone heard from the stairwell was Sarah's voice, calm and clear despite everything, speaking to Mrs. Petrov. "It's okay, we got you. We're doctors. We'll keep you safe." The time was 12:25 p.m. Outside, the firefighters were rushing into the building, but they were moments too late. The young couple who had pledged their lives to each other less than an hour ago were making their final sacrifice together, living up to their oath to protect life until their last breath. Their wedding rings, still shiny and new, glinted one last time in the flickering light of the flames as the stairwell collapsed around them. The firefighters fought their way through the burning building, their oxygen masks and protective gear allowing them to push forward where others couldn't. Captain Rodriguez led the team, following the last known location of the voices they'd heard. The smoke was so thick, it was like trying to see through black wool. 2 doctors and an elderly woman, he shouted through his mask to his team. Second-floor stairwell. The heat was intense, even through their protective gear. Beams creaked ominously overhead as they made their way through the building. The explosion from the oxygen tank had compromised the structure more than they'd initially feared. Through the smoke and chaos, they caught glimpses of white, Sarah's wedding dress, now almost unrecognizable under the soot and debris. The sight of it made even these seasoned firefighters' hearts clench. They'd heard from the crowd outside that the doctors were newlyweds, married less than an hour ago. "Over here," firefighter Martinez called out, his flashlight beam cutting through the smoke to illuminate 3 figures huddled together on the landing. Michael was still conscious, barely. He had positioned himself to take the brunt of the falling debris, using his body to shield both Sarah and Mrs. Petrov. His once pristine tuxedo was torn and burned, but he maintained his protective stance. "Help. Her first," he managed to say, gesturing weakly to Mrs. Petrov. His medical training still governed his actions, even in these final moments. "She needs oxygen." Sarah was still holding Mrs. Petrov's hand, checking her pulse even as her own consciousness faded. Her medical instincts remained strong, despite the severe smoke inhalation. Her wedding ring left a clean circle on her soot-covered finger as she maintained her grip on her patient's wrist. "We need a medical team here now," Captain Rodriguez shouted into his radio. "Multiple victims, severe smoke inhalation." The rescue was complicated by the unstable structure. As they worked to free the 3 people, more debris rained down from above. The building was groaning, a sound every firefighter knew meant imminent collapse. "We have to move fast," Rodriguez ordered. "This whole section's about to go." They managed to reach Mrs. Petrov first, carefully extracting her from Sarah's protective grip. The elderly woman was unconscious but breathing. As they began to move her, Sarah used her last bit of strength to whisper her vital signs to the rescue team, her final act as a doctor. Michael remained conscious longest, still trying to protect his bride. Sarah, he whispered, reaching for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, wedding rings touching. I love. The rest of his words were lost as another section of the ceiling gave way. The firefighters lunged forward, but the debris forced them back momentarily. Those few seconds made all the difference. When they finally reached the Newlyweds, it was too late. They found Michael and Sarah still holding hands, their bodies intertwined as if in their first dance rather than their last embrace. Their faces were peaceful, as if they'd simply fallen asleep together. The time was 12:30 p.m. Outside, the gathered crowd watched in horror as the firefighters emerged from the building. Mrs. Petrov was rushed to an ambulance, her life saved by the sacrifice of two young doctors who had chosen to help others on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Minutes later, two more stretchers emerged, side by side. On them lay Sarah and Michael, still holding hands, still wearing their wedding clothes, now forever joined, not just in marriage but in sacrifice. The firefighters stood at attention as the bodies were carried past, a spontaneous guard of honor for two people who had given everything to save others. Captain Rodriguez removed his helmet, bowing his head in respect. In 20 years of firefighting, he would later tell reporters, I've never seen anything like it. They could have left after saving the first couple. They could have waited for us to arrive. Instead, they went back in. They died as they lived, helping others. The spring breeze that had earlier carried rose petals now carried ash and smoke into the sky. In the distance, the cathedral bells that had celebrated their wedding now told a different message. And in the crowd of onlookers, someone began to sing Amazing Grace, a hymn spreading through the gathered people like a wave of grief and gratitude. Sarah Chen and Michael Torres had been married for exactly 45 minutes. In that brief time, they had lived their vows to the fullest, in sickness and in health, until death did them part. The news spread through the wedding reception venue like a wave of ice. The wedding coordinator, who had been arranging the final touches on the flower centerpieces, received the call first. She dropped her phone, her hands shaking as she turned to face the waiting guests. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom, decorated in shades of blue and white, stood frozen in time. The three-tiered wedding cake remained uncut, its sugar flowers pristine. Two champagne glasses sat empty at the head table, waiting for a toast that would never come. The dance floor, where the newlyweds should have shared their first dance, remained untouched. David Chen, Sarah's father, was the first to recognize something was wrong. He had been checking his watch repeatedly, worried about his daughter's delay. When he saw the wedding coordinator's face, he knew. Carmen Torres, Michael's mother, grabbed her husband's arm as the police officers entered the ballroom. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Mr. and Mrs. Torres, one officer said softly, "Could you please come with us?" The families were led to a private room, where they received the news that would shatter their world. Their children, married less than an hour ago, had perished trying to save others from a burning building. The room erupted in grief. Carmen collapsed into her husband's arms, while Lisa Chen stood in shocked silence, still holding the camera that contained the last photos of her daughter alive. Outside the private room, the news rippled through the wedding guests. Many were medical professionals themselves, colleagues who had worked alongside Sarah and Michael. They understood, perhaps better than most, the instinct that had driven their friends into that burning building. It was the same instinct that made them work long hours in the ER, that kept them going during difficult surgeries, that made them choose medicine as their calling. James, the best man, found himself standing next to the table where he had placed his speech notes. He picked up the papers with trembling hands, reading the words he would never get to share. Michael and Sarah don't just practice medicine, they live it. Their dedication to helping others isn't just a career choice, it's who they are. Rachel, the maid of honor, sat in a corner, still wearing her pale blue bridesmaid dress, tears streaming down her face. She held Sarah's bridal bouquet, the white roses now a cruel reminder of what should have been a joyous day. At Pine Valley Hospice, just 15 minutes away, Maria Torres lay in her bed, unaware that her beloved grandson would never arrive for his promised visit. The nurses, who had been excitedly preparing for the newlyweds' arrival, now whispered in hushed tones, unsure how to break the news to the elderly woman. Back at the scene of the fire, firefighters worked to secure the building while investigators began their preliminary examination. They found the wet towels the couple had used, Sarah's discarded wedding shoes by their car, and Michael's tuxedo jacket still perfectly folded on the car seat. The just married sign on their car fluttered in the breeze, the tin cans creating a soft, mournful sound as they moved. Inside the car, two phones lay silent. Dozens of missed calls and messages from worried family and friends would remain forever unanswered. Mrs. Petrov, the elderly woman they had died trying to save, was rushed to Metropolitan General Hospital, the very hospital where Sarah and Michael had worked, where they had first met, where they had fallen in love. The emergency room staff, many of whom had been invited to the wedding, found themselves fighting to save the life their friends had died protecting. As evening fell, the families gathered at the Chen residence, surrounded by the wedding gifts that would never be opened. David Chen held his wife as she clutched their daughter's wedding veil, found untouched in the bridal suite where Sarah had dressed just hours before. Robert Torres, the retired firefighter, stood at the window, his firefighter's badge in his hand. He understood better than anyone the split-second decision his son and daughter-in-law had made. "They died as heroes," he said softly, his voice breaking. The time was 7:00 p.m. In the short span of 12 hours, two families had gained children through marriage and lost them to tragedy. Two promising medical careers had ended at their peak. Two lives, just joined together, had ended together. But in their final moments, Sarah Chen and Michael Torres had lived up to their medical oath in the purest way possible. They had given their lives to save others. Their wedding day had become their legacy day. 1 year after the tragic wedding day, hundreds of people gathered in front of Metropolitan General Hospital for the unveiling of a memorial. A bronze statue depicted Sarah and Michael in their wedding attire, their hands clasped together, eternally watching over the hospital where their story began. The ceremony drew people from all walks of life. Mrs. Petrov sat in the front row, tears rolling down her cheeks as she clutched a photo of the young couple. Behind her sat the Wong family from apartment 3A, who had survived thanks to Sarah and Michael's first rescue attempt. The firefighters who had tried to save them stood in full dress uniform, Captain Rodriguez among them. Today we honor not just two lives lost, but a legacy of sacrifice that continues to inspire, the hospital's chief of medicine began his speech. From tragedy, we have witnessed the birth of something remarkable. In the years since their deaths, the story of the Newlywed doctors had touched hearts across the nation. Their families had channeled their grief into action, establishing the Chen Torres Foundation for Emergency Medical Services. The foundation had already funded specialized training for first responders and provided scholarships to medical students committed to emergency medicine. The hospital's emergency department had been renamed the Chen Torres Emergency Center. Inside, a new protocol had been established. The Golden Hour Response Program, inspired by Sarah and Michael's quick decision to help others even in their wedding attire. The program had already saved countless lives through improved coordination between medical staff and first responders. Maria Torres, Michael's grandmother, had lived long enough to see the first class of Chen Torres scholars graduate. Though wheelchair-bound, she had personally presented the scholarships, telling each recipient about her grandson and the woman who had been her granddaughter for less than an hour. In the medical residence lounge, where Sarah and Michael had spent countless hours, a wall now displayed their story. Their white coats hung side by side, a reminder to every new doctor of the ultimate meaning of their profession. Beneath the coats, a plaque bore their favorite saying, "In every moment, we have a choice to help or to walk away. Choose help." The impact of their sacrifice reached beyond the medical community. Local building codes had been revised, with new requirements for emergency access and oxygen tank storage. The apartment building where they died had been rebuilt with state-of-the-art safety systems, funded in part by donations from people touched by their story. Rachel and James, who had stood beside them at the altar, now served on the foundation's board. They had made it their mission to keep their friend's memory alive through action rather than just remembrance. The foundation's annual fundraiser was held on Sarah and Michael's wedding anniversary, transforming a day of tragedy into one of hope and purpose. The Chen and Torres families, once joined by marriage and then by grief, had grown closer through their shared mission. They worked together to ensure that their children's brief union would continue to save lives long after their own had ended. At the ceremony's conclusion, David Chen and Robert Torres together unveiled the plaque beneath the statue. It read, "Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Michael Torres, married in love, united in sacrifice, forever in our hearts." Their 45 minutes of marriage taught us that true love means being willing to give everything for others. As the crowd dispersed, a young medical student lingered, studying the statue. She had just received one of the Centauri's scholarships, and the weight of that honor felt especially heavy today. A passing nurse noticed her and stopped. I worked with them, the nurse said softly. They would have loved knowing that their story is inspiring new generations of doctors. The student nodded, touching the base of the statue. I keep thinking about how they had their whole lives ahead of them, she said. All their plans, their dreams. They lived those dreams, the nurse replied. Maybe not in the way they expected, but in the purest way possible. They proved that being a doctor isn't just about wearing a white coat. It's about being willing to help others no matter the circumstance. As the sun set behind the hospital, casting long shadows across the new memorial, the last rays caught the bronze wedding rings on the statue's clasped hands. In that golden light, Sarah and Michael's legacy seemed to glow with its own inner fire, a beacon of hope, sacrifice, and the enduring power of love expressed through service to others. Their wedding had lasted just 45 minutes, but their impact would last for generations to come.